My husband and I saw what we believed to be a Sasquatch on the night of June 12th, 2021. We were driving home together with our daughter at approximately 9:30 p.m. when we turned onto our street. Mind you, we live in the deep countryside outside of Lawrenceburg, Tennessee. My husband turned the wheel slightly to turn onto our street, and there was an animal figure with fingers touching something on the ground, picking at it with its fingers. When the animal saw our headlights turning, it intentionally averted the headlights, ducking underneath them. It was only about 5 feet from us in front of our vehicle at one point when we turned toward it. It was fully in the headlights. The animal then bounded across our neighbor's yard. It did not run on 2 feet the way a human would. We thought the animal was a gorilla at first. Its movements looked extremely human-like. It bounded with its front legs in the same way that a gorilla does, except its arms were so long, it moved unbelievably fast. Of course, we considered that it could have been a person dressed in a hairy costume, but it moved way too fast to be a person. It was definitely not a bear. It was more like a gorilla, or a person covered with hair. It was covered in dark brown or black hair. The animal cleared our neighbor's 250 to 300-foot grass lawn in only about 6 seconds, then disappearing from view. Our daughter, who was 4, did not see the animal, as she was playing on her iPad. When we pulled up to our house a minute later, I was terrified to get out of the vehicle. We had no idea what we had seen, and because it was so fast, it could have turned around and been to our house in about 10 seconds. I got up the courage to run to my house door and unlock it, as we all ran inside. We were terrified. We both saw the animal. However, it was my husband who saw it that had fingers, and it was observing something on the ground. I did not see that part. I just saw the part where it began to run, and when it cleared our neighbor's lawn. We had considered that maybe it was a bear, but it was just too ape-like to have been a bear, and it was too fast and slim. It did not run on all fours of its legs exactly the way a bear would have. Not to mention, a bear does not walk on 2 legs this comfortably. This incident took place during the summer of 2017 in an area of Washington state. Our group was built of 4 persons staying the night in a free camping area. I do not remember the exact date, only that it was late August of 2017. The campground only had 1 trailer in the entire area, and it was a family with 2 small children. We were in 2 tents. I had drawn the short straw and was sleeping in the back of one of our vehicles. The campground is very remote, no cell service, 1 road in a kind of situation, and runs along a river. It also coincides with free-range area for cattle. We spent the day playing games and hanging out at the river. The night was spent by the fire, typical camping trope. We all retired to our sleeping quarters. It was roughly 3 in the morning when I woke to a rustling outside. I was in the back of the Jeep. The windows were down, and the doors unlocked. It was pitch black outside, and I sat up and looked out. There, hunched over the picnic table, was a large black mass going through our stuff for trash. Yes, I understand the variables at play in this situation. We had left our trash out, raccoons or bears being the best bet. However, the argument I have, and what I know for a fact what plays over in my head, this mass was almost leaning on the bench, seating, hunching over, cycling through our bags and trash. Not to mention later that morning, once we all had to go out and inspect the area, there was no mess, no trash scattered, or a scene that happens when animals do come into camp. When I saw it at first, my natural instinct was bear, so I slowly rolled up the windows and locked the doors. I watched this thing about 15 feet away. An absolute black mass in pitch dark forest moved from one side of the camp to the other. I did not have a flashlight. Even if I used my phone, I was shaking with fear, for myself and my friends were only feet away in tents. I lay down and closed my eyes and just waited till light broke through the trees. When I sat up again with barely an hour of sleep, it was now 8 in the morning, and to my left was a massive bull. It meandered around camp for a few minutes, but didn't do anything. At first, I chalked that experience up to it being a cow. But the cow had left distinct hoof marks, and the length of the cow was not what I saw. Not to mention this figure that I witnessed was tall. I couldn't put a number on it. It showed a certain dexterity, only a biped sort of thing could have. I want to note that I've gone every which way to make this a bear. In my head, I play it back and try to make it out as a bear, and a bear only. But it just does not seem possible. Only till now do I see it as something else. I live near Asheville, North Carolina. I own a landscaping and irrigation company. I grew up about an hour east. My parents had 30 acres that was surrounded by 6,000 acres of game land. I've played in the woods, hunted, and camped my entire life. Plus, my business also allows me to be outside year-round. I was starting up an irrigation system in a large gated and wooded Gulf community in the mountains of Arden, North Carolina, basically about 15 minutes from Asheville. This community joins the Pisgah National Forest, approximately 300 square miles of forest. This was around April or June of 2016. I was standing in the backyard, facing the control box, which is attached to the house. So, my back was to the woods, maybe 30 yards to the tree line. And I hear this large crash. The same sound a large tree makes as it falls through other tree limbs when it's falling. I turn quickly to see a massive beech tree rocking back and forth. Leaves were floating down, but no tree was falling. I've been in trees this size. I'm 6'2", 250 pounds. There's no way I can make this tree rock like this. But I did not see what did it. So, watched for probably 30 to 45 seconds. Nothing happened. So I turned to finish my work. Then it happened again, but a different tree. This time I knew something was up. Bears don't jump from tree to tree like that. So I walked to the edge of the yard and watched for a few moments. No movement in the trees. The canopy is very thick here. The only way I could have really seen anything that was hiding would have been to walk to the bottom of the tree and look up. But I was not about to do that. So, after a while, I walked back to the control again. But I walked backwards. It seemed silly, but I felt it was whatever it was watching me. When I reached the control, I turned to face it. Then, turned back to the woods again quickly, to see if I could trick it or catch it jumping. Nothing happened. I began working again, assuming the show was over. Then it happened again. A third big tree, rocking after a loud crash. At this point, I was so freaked out, so I ran to the truck and left. I just rescheduled the job. I've been in the forest for my whole life. Never been afraid in the daytime. Bears don't do that. They climb up and down. Cats don't make loud crashes if they would have to when they run after the first one. Whatever did this had to have been huge. I could not make those trees rock even if I wanted to. Plus, it was watching and waiting for the perfect time to jump, so I would not see it. Bears here aren't that worried about being seen. They know they can't be hunted in those developments. You have to make them leave. This was something different. I wish I had the balls to walk to the base of the trees, but I don't. I was afraid. I've been training to handle myself. I always carry a gun, but this wasn't something I could handle. I just know. I was hiking about 2 to 3 miles from our camp in Wenatchee National Forest and was sitting on a bluff that gives an excellent view of the surrounding ridges. After a while of sitting and seeing nothing, I hear a series of heavy thudding sounds as if they were in rhythm of a person walking. I had no idea what it was. I thought maybe it was a deer bouncing away, but it didn't quite sound right. The thuds were almost cartoonish. Real heavy and loud. Then, about 5 minutes later, I hear what sounds exactly like somebody banging 2 rocks together. I was still deeply confused as to what the sound could be. It sounded like it was maybe 40 to 50 yards away, just into the tree and brush, out of sight. I got up, grabbed my rifle, and started down to where the sound was. When I was about 10 feet away from the trees, I had the Sasquatch epiphany. So, speak, realizing it might be Sasquatch. Every hair on my body stood on end as I made my way immediately back to the top of the bluff. I was still hearing the rock banging, so I grabbed 2 rocks and banged them 3 times back at it. There was a pause, and then I heard 3 bangs back. I went back and forth with this thing for about 5 to 10 minutes. It would mimic the number of bangs I would do. I would do 2 bangs. It did 2 bangs. I did 4 bangs. It did 4 bangs. I was far too freaked out at this point to investigate further. Especially, it was getting dark. So I made my way back to camp and shared the story. There's only one way to access that area, and nobody else had been up there. My friends suggested maybe a bear was just snapping its jaws, but there was a nearby gut pile from a deer my brother had shot earlier that day, and was untouched. If a bear was in the area, I would think it would have investigated the guts. Later, I had my dad stand about as far away from me as I thought the sounds were, and had him bang 2 rocks. It sounded exactly the same. I'm not sure what it could have been, other than a Sasquatch. We were the only people up that camping road. In October of 1997, I was returning home from work on US Highway 2 and 41, just outside of Gladstone, Michigan, in the Upper Peninsula. I got off work at 5, picked up my kids from daycare, stopped at the local sub shop, and headed out of town. My son was in the front seat with me, and daughters were in the back. We had just left Gladstone city limits on a 4-lane highway, heading northeast to our hometown of Rapid River, when I noticed what I thought was a hunter crouched down on the opposite side of the median of the highway. I was the only car heading that direction. There were 2 cars heading southwest in the other lanes. As I approached, I said to my son, "Look at that stupid hunter. Why is he just sitting there?" But as we got closer, the man, or now I say creature, stood up. It was brown-colored, just like the grass, which in October in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, everything turns brown. It crossed the highway with a couple of steps. It then was on the other side of the highway within seconds. As I passed, it put its arms down to its sides, stepping into the woods, and it was gone. I have lived in the Upper Peninsula my entire life. I am a logger's daughter. I have spent countless hours in the woods. I've seen bears, deer, wolves, coyotes, almost every living creature here in the Upper Peninsula. I own horses, and this thing moved faster and more graceful than a horse at a full gallop. My mind raced after I saw this thing, looking for the logical answer of what this could be, and the only thing that it could have been was a Bigfoot. I cannot describe how big this thing was, how long its arms were, and how fast it moved and disappeared into the woods. Even though very close to town, this area is very swampy. No people live here. But I have to say that 2 days after that I saw the creature, it was reported on the local radio station that a Bigfoot was spotted on the same highway. The DJ made fun of the report. This is why I never reported it to anybody. Wish you guys were around when this happened. All I know is that to this day, every time I drive past that spot, I think of the creature that I saw that day. I know that that will go to my grave, knowing that I saw one of nature's greatest secrets. The incident occurred on June 9th, 2021, at approximately 5:15 p.m. It began raining around 3:30 p.m., ending around 5. I had to get the grass mowed. It was already too long. Usually, when I mow, I have my cell phone in my shirt pocket, but since it rained, I didn't want to take the chance of it getting wet, so I just left it in the house. I was mowing in the direction of north to south. There are several large farm fields behind my house. In between these properties are 3 large depressions in the land, where a larger vehicle could park and nobody would see it. Through these particular spots are cart paths that run along the bottom, also running from north to south. As I was mowing, a dark figure appeared down by the corner of one of the fields. approximately 150 to 200 yards out. I stopped and looked and was wondering if it was the neighbor, maybe checking his trail cams at that point to the north. I took my mower over to the woodpile, which is approximately 35 yards closer, to get a better view. The field was just planted with soybeans, so I couldn't go in with the mower. At that point, the dark figure was just east of the trail, and I was hoping it would cross the path of the trail cam, but it seemed to avoid the area. This dark figure was following the deer trail that are 40 yards east of the trail cam. So I asked myself, what am I looking at? Knowing it had just rained, who would be back there? I idled the mower down and noticed the toadstools around the woodpile, thought maybe it was a mushroom hunter. But this person was black from head to toe, and mushroom season is basically over by now. This large figure began to move across the second field, heading northeast along where the deer usually go, down into a large depression in the field. As it was moving across, I knew there was no way I would have enough time to get my cell phone or binoculars in time to view it. So I sat there and observed it, following the deer trail, knowing it was not a black bear walking on two legs. The whole time I was thinking, nobody's going to believe me. It seemed to cross the field without any trouble and cleared the field within a matter of a minute and a half. As it disappeared into the chest-high weeds, I sat there for approximately 5 minutes, waiting to see if it would reappear on the other side, or head toward a large section of woods which have several trail cams along the perimeter of the woods. I also scanned the tree line for any vehicles that might be there from somebody walking out, but there weren't any. I could not figure out what I just seen. I finished mowing. I didn't even tell my wife about it until a few days later. At my first opportunity on June 12th, we took our golf cart back into the area to see if we can find any prints or tracks. To our disappointment, the field had been tilled. Where the field was filled with weeds, grass, and corn stalks, it made it very hard to find footprints. We also followed the path that it took up to the largest part of the depression in the field. This is where you can see the game trail going in and out of the chest-high weeds. We also took the cart down into the lower part of the depression via the mowed paths that are back. On June 13th, we conducted a reenactment with our 15-year-old son. He's about 5'11", 235 pounds. We had him dressed in a black Adidas sweatsuit that had white lettering and stripes on it. My wife took him on the golf cart to the area where I saw the black figure. I sat at the back of the woodpile on my mower to watch for him. Through cell phone conversations with my son, I had him put up his hood and walk the same path, 3/4 of the way through the field, all in black. My first observation was that what I saw on June 9th was much bigger, and moved through the field easier than my son did. He was trying not to walk on the newly planted soybeans, trying to miss the old corn stalks in the field. Because of this, it took my son much longer to cross. He was close enough that I could actually see the white parts of his pants. Because of that, I know that what I saw was all black. Note, in May, we saw less deer in the area, possibly due to the farmer tilling the field. And for the month of June, we have taken cart rides and have seen less deer in the area overall. I haven't told too many people for fear of being made fun of. My wife didn't really believe me until we did the reenactment. She even says that there's no way you can miss something all black from head to toe back there. I just can't seem to shake it from my mind. At around 11 p.m., on July 26th, my wife and I were night fishing on the backwater of Crane's Nest River in Dickinson County, Virginia. My wife's head was hurting, so she decided to take a nap, and we had heard something large walking in the woods, but wrote it off as a bear or a deer, as both are plentiful in our area. She had been asleep for about an hour when we heard a large knock about 50 yards up in the tree line. Then, about 15 to 20 seconds later, several hundred yards up the ridge, there was another knock. Both sounded as if somebody had taken a 4x4 post and struck a tree with it. 10 minutes later, this splash sounded like something weighing 20 to 30 pounds had struck the water, waking my wife. It's not unusual to hear large fish jumping at night, But this was different. After the splash, no more than a couple of minutes had passed, and there were 2 more knocks. They were closer than the first one. We pulled anchor, reeled in our lines as we were leaving. We heard 2 more. My wife said she heard the knocks up on the ridge, but I did not hear those. Just the sound of a large animal walking up the river the same way we were traveling, as if it were following us. When it came to a shallow cove where it would have had to swim, we stopped hearing the walking sounds. This is the second time we encountered this animal. We had an experience about a month earlier, and we heard a big animal walking around. We heard big splashes in the water, as if it were throwing things at us that night as well. Driving westbound, my brother and I were doing approximately 60 miles per hour on Route 224. 3 fire trucks from the Odessa Montour Fire Department were coming in the opposite direction, lights and sirens on as they were responding to a call. Suddenly, this creature darted across the road from our left to right. It was illuminated by fire trucks and our headlights. I yelled to my brother, "Don't hit that kid." That was when we realized it was not a human or animal. We thought the lead fire truck was going to hit it. We believe it was spooked by the lights and sirens and panicked. It ran extremely fast on 2 legs, leaning slightly forward, with what we estimated today to be a stride of about 5 to 6 feet, as the road was approximately 30 feet wide. It was completely blackened from head to toe, and approximately 6 to 7 feet tall. It swung its arms in an ape-like fashion at its sides, as if to gain momentum. Unlike the way a human pumps their arms and fists for speed when running, that's how we knew it wasn't a person. The creature did not look in either direction as it darted across the road. It acted like a scared animal. We returned to the site this morning and did not find any tracks. The ground was completely hard and dry at the time. No alcohol involved. On July 9th, at approximately 10 a.m., I noticed my 5 chickens were missing. The chicken coop was full of feathers, but no bodies or blood. I did a perimeter check and came across an extremely large footprint. I went back to the house and brought down a tape measure to the footprint, measured it, took pictures with the tape measure beside it. The footprint measured length 18 inches and around 9 to 10 inches wide. On the 23rd of July, Tim Thompson, who is a BFRO investigator of Ohio, had contacted me, and he came out to investigate. During Jim's first visit, he found 4 more footprints near the original. Jim stated that the other prints were about 4 feet spread apart from each other. On July 24th, at approximately 12:38 a.m., I heard a sort of yelping noise coming from one end of my property and heard a quick response. Same type of noise come from the other end. At nighttime now, every now and then, on my property, I get an eerie feeling that something or someone is watching me. This evening, I decided to venture past the communication building as the foliage was still at ease. I continued another half-mile up the path where the power line crosses the river. From here, the river bank drops 15 feet, giving a nice view of the river below. As I approached this area, my eyes were immediately caught by somebody down below at the river's edge. What I saw was an all-black figure down at the river's edge, about 250 feet away. I thought it was strange because not many people hike off trail in the preserve, especially during the summers nor late in the evening or even past the communication building. As I watched this man down at the riverbank, I began to notice subtle details like golden red hair in the sunset. I also didn't notice any distinct clothing, but hair alone. At this moment, I remember being very confused as to what I was seeing. Whoever was down at that river began to walk inland, using its arms to move the reed bushes. That I saw its long hair dangling from its arm, shoulder to hand. And I thought, this has to be a Bigfoot. I immediately began to reach for my phone without taking my eyes off the creature. That's of course when it noticed me. What terrified me the most was not able to make out any details in the face as we made eye contact. That's when I ran. I continued to run until I met a couple with their dog back at the communication building. I will never forget the look of confusion on their faces when I come sprinting around the corner. I wanted to tell them so bad about my experience, but I continued to run, as I knew they would not believe me. The following day, I returned to look for prints, but was unable to venture into the overgrown foliage. The experience was not enough to scare me away completely. Instead, it's made me all the more cautious, especially of my surroundings. I continued to exercise all around that area until I moved to Arizona in July of 2019. This sighting has stayed with me for a long time. I did not want to submit it at first, but based on the number of sightings identified, I'm now forwarding on what I saw. My son and I were driving down County Road 200 in Liberty Hill, Texas. We came to the end, made a right turn on County Road 236. We were heading towards Killeen, Texas at the time, and it was in the morning. At the time, the car I was driving had two little plastic pieces on the front of it that were designed to create sound to scare away deer. I got them because my car was small, and I didn't know if that would help. But as this is an area with a lot of deer, it was worth a try. I'm not sure if this is what scared what I saw. Just after we made the right on the County Road 236, I saw what I thought was a gorilla on the left side of the road. It seemed agitated, and as we got closer, it ran across the road, climbed into a tree on the other side. At that point, I saw the tree move wildly, with the leaves and branches swaying like it was extremely angry, or like a strong wind had hit it. As the day was calm, the only thing that could have caused this was whatever jumped into the tree. I did not look up, and I didn't stop due to my son being with me. But that sighting has always remained with me, as it was so unusual. I've seen gorillas in the zoo. It looked similar. I would say that it was relatively tall and was standing on its hind legs. As I got closer to it, it raced across the street in front of us. It didn't seem as tall as I would have imagined, maybe 6 feet. It was hard to tell height from where I was in correlation to what I saw, though. After this event, I even checked to see if any gorillas had escaped anywhere near me, but didn't find anything. To many, this will sound like a tall tale, but to me, it is a very vivid memory. First of all, thank you for taking my story. I was born in Clay County, Kentucky. I have lived in several states since: Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and now West Virginia. My story takes place while living on the Kentucky and West Virginia border in 2008. The coal industry is a very important part of the economy in this area. Underground mining requires battery-operated equipment due to the exhaust of internal combustion engines. I was working for a company that rebuilt the batteries that ran the equipment. These batteries weighed 100 to 150 pounds each. I picked up some batteries for one of the mines in our area and started on my route. I went to Charleston, West Virginia, turned down Route 5, which led me into a very rural area. The road went from blacktop to gravel, then to dirt. It was about 5 p.m., and being in the fall of the year, the day began to wane and evening began to fall. I had my headlights on as I made my way along the dirt road. I was traveling at about 15 miles an hour and was going along a small river that ran alongside my left. I rounded a turn, found a low-water bridge crossing the stream. A low-water bridge is made of some pipe that allows the water to flow through them, and concrete is poured over to make the roadways. These are always 1 lane wide, and usually close to the water. Lining up with the bridge, I noticed 3 or 4 deer off to my right. Along with some birds on the left side of the bridge was a bear. I've seen many bear down where I worked, but only black bears, some 300 to 400 pounds. This one, however, was very brown and very shaggy. I thought how odd. I've never seen a brown bear in that area, and certainly not one that is that big. It was sitting on its haunches, looking down into the water. I had the window about halfway down on my driver's side as I approached it. As I got closer, I thought, that's not a bear. When I got within about 5 yards of it, it stood up and turned to look at me. It must have been at least 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide at the shoulders. No neck that I could see. I've never been this close to an animal that size in my life. It was a brindle color, brown, black and gray all mingled together. Its head was kind of pointed, had no hair on its face, which looked almost human. It didn't look angry or threatening, just kind of interested in my being there. The hair, several inches long, hung down from its arms. Its hands were almost to its knees. Bears do not have front legs like that. I should know. I've seen enough of them fairly up close, and they sure don't have hands. As I drove by, it looked down at me in my pickup, and I realized just how large it was. I was within 5 feet of it, and it was maybe going 3 to 5 miles per hour as I passed it. There was no foul smell that I can remember, and I've heard that that seems to come with them. Approaching the end of the bridge, I looked in my outside mirror, and it turned and stepped off the bridge into what must have been about 4 feet of water, which didn't even come to its waist. I remember saying to myself, that wasn't a bear. I watched it as it crossed the stream and climbed up the opposite bank with a hand-over motion, holding onto trees as it went. Coming back that way after my delivery, it was dark. I saw no sign of it anywhere. Several years have gone by now, and I'm now 71 years old. I've not told anybody about what I saw, until recently. I shared my story with my father-in-law. I told him I would understand if he didn't believe me. But to my surprise, he'd worked in that area and said, there's something down there people claim to have seen for years. What myself and my brother-in-law found was a structure built of mainly blackberry vines. We were scouting for deer on an abandoned farm in an area that had been stripped for coal about 35 years prior. Deer was plentiful, but not as much as present day. When we came across it, we were both following a path that materialized and split into 2 directions around a spoil bank. My brother-in-law went one way, I the other. Both paths lead to the top of the soil where we came onto the structure. We were in total amazement, noting it was kind of an igloo shape with an opening to enter. The briars were woven together to form the walls, and the inside had been cleared, like it had been mowed. We stood amazed at what could have made it. We had never heard much about a Bigfoot at the time. Nobody in their right mind would have been in that area fighting thorny vegetation and biting insects to create such a thing. Then, about a month later, the same brother-in-law and his cousin were walking out of a hollow near dark, and they heard the strangest animal they've ever heard. When they went to try and tell the family about it, they got laughed at. Neither ever forgot it or entered the property in the dark. It wasn't until maybe 20 years later, when I happened on a Bigfoot program show showing such a structure, that bell went off as to what we'd saw. Also, around the time, other people had reported seeing things peeking in windows around the county. Summer of 2020, quarantine year. In late July, I was hiking with a friend along the Rio Chama. Although we were just on the other side of the river from town, the railroad was not running. The campground was closed, and the majority of the town was empty. This was a short day hike, as we are seniors. We had a dog accompanying us, a pit bull mix, for part of the way. Before we reached the river, we had to return the dog to the car. She became unusually excitable and fearful. Note: my friend and the dog live up on the mountain. The dog is very used to wildlife and has treed a bear before. Anyway, windows down and dog much happier, we returned to our walk. We had crossed the river and was on the trail that runs by the bank when we heard a series of hollow knocking sounds. These were loud and resonant, not woodpeckers or falling branches. A short time later, they were repeated at a distance, the knocks sounding lighter in tone, like a hit on more solid wood. The knocks close to us responded. We decided that it was in our best interest to leave the area now. It had to have been the summer of 2015, 16, or 17. I was camping with my son's troop in Moraine State Park in Butler County, Pennsylvania. I woke up in the middle of the night. I want to say it was around midnight, but cannot be so sure. This would have had to have been a Friday night into Saturday morning. I was taken aback by how quiet the woods were. Being a seasoned tent camper, this struck me as odd. Our tent was the closest to the shoreline, maybe 30 or 40 yards of woods in between us and the shore. The deep woods were on the other side of a trail from our tent site. Up the shoreline, I heard what sounded like a tree or a rock knock. The knock continued for a little bit, and was eventually answered by other tree knocks coming from two distinct locations in the deep woods. The answered calls seemed pretty far in the distance, but still audible. The original knock came from our side of the shore, and was closer than the other two. This happened for a little while. The answering calls never changed, but the knock on our side kept getting closer to our tent site. I was actually astonished at how fast the knocks were moving down the shoreline. By what I mean, the knock source closest to us was coming toward our campsite, working its way down the shoreline. Whatever was making the knocks was moving at a good speed for being in the woods at night. Then, the knock stopped right when it felt like the source was directly behind us. The following night was Saturday. I woke up again, but this time, the woods were their normal sounding self, and there was boat life on the lake. I did hear another knock, fairly distant in the woods, but that was the only one. I want to share an experience my family and I had near Lake City, Colorado, on June 12, 2021. We have visited Lake City for several years in a row, spending a week there each summer. One of our favorite places is actually Deer Lakes, about 15 miles southeast of Lake City off of Highway 149. We always spend several evenings out there fishing, cooking out, and watching wildlife. Also found in that area are two ponds known as the Upper Mill Pond, nearest Highway 149, and the Lower Mill Pond, another mile or two down the road. On our way to Deer Lakes this visit, we stopped at the Upper Mill Pond to fish, but we saw a cow moose and two calves just below the pond, eating in the runoff creek. We almost always see moose near Deer Lakes. While we were watching the moose from the cab of our truck, we heard the undisputable sound of a woodknock. At first, none of us thought much about it, until we heard another one. I was in the driver's seat, furthest away from the pond and the moose. My daughter being in the back seat on the driver's side, while my wife was in the front passenger seat nearest the pond and the moose. The girls thought the sound came from the direction of the pond, but I thought it came from the other direction. The pond and the road to Deer Lakes sits in a valley between two ridges. The tree line on the east, or pond side, is only about 100 yards away from the road, while the tree line to the west, or opposite the pond, varies. In some places, a few hundred yards from the road, and other places, not far off at all. My daughter and I got out of the cab of the truck to listen, all after we heard the second knock. Then, she and I both believed the sounds were coming from west of the tree line. We waited, listening, and heard another knock, this time, seemingly from a different position from the first two knocks. In a bit, another vehicle stopped to watch the moose. When they arrived, we heard another knock. A third vehicle drove past, and we heard still another knock as it went by. In all, we heard what I would guess to be about 8 to 10 knocks, from at least 3 different positions, but all on the west side of the road. My family and I talked about it. It was possible that there were a few guys in the woods making the sounds. Maybe one guy knocking on a tree. Then another heard it and knocked back. That's possible. However, what sealed it as a Bigfoot for me happened later that night. After we heard the knocks up by Upper Mill Pond while watching the moose, we went to the Deer Lakes where we had planned to fish, but our lines were too tangled. We did get to cook though. As the sun went down, we left Deer Lakes, but drove further away from the highway, waiting until it got very dark before we went back to town so we could see the stars. Just off of Highway 149 on the road to Deer Lakes is a staging area so people can park trailers to unload their ATVs. There is also a forced apartment bathroom there. That is where we parked to stargaze. As soon as we got out of the truck and shut the doors, we heard a knock from the east ridge of the mountains. This tree line is several hundred yards away from the road. It was not pitch dark. We could still make out the silhouette of a mountain against the backdrop of the sky, but it was too dark to make out any individual trees. I can't imagine any reason that anybody would be up on that ridge, especially at this time of night, in the dark, in the cold, just waiting for the possible chance that somebody would stop at the staging area and get out of their vehicle so they could hoax them with a wood knock. I believed for sure at the time that was a Bigfoot in the area. In full disclosure, I am a Bigfoot enthusiast. I watch all the TV shows. I watch videos on YouTube. I've been a member of multiple forums. But I live near Amarillo, Texas, where it is flat, dry farmland. There's no Bigfoot hunting around here. I always keep my eyes open, though, when we visit the mountains or wooded areas. But this is my first experience of anything that I would possibly contribute in any way to Bigfoot. On a related note, a few years ago on an earlier trip to Lake City in Deer Lakes, my family and I were getting ready to leave Deer Lakes. I had to visit the men's room before we drove back to town. So my wife and daughter were walking up the path from the lakes to the parking lot. They heard what they described as an incredible crash, very loud and sudden. An adult male moose was in the upper lake eating when the crash occurred. This moose was frightened so much that he raced out of the water into the woods, scaring my family terribly. When I came out of the restroom, they were at the truck, asked me if I heard the crash. I had not heard anything somehow. They told me what happened, and I instantly thought of Bigfoot pushing over a tree in the woods up from the lake. There is no way for us to know for sure. The girls certainly did not want to go into the woods to investigate, so we could possibly have had 2 Bigfoot encounters at or near Deer Lakes. I'm almost positive we heard them knocking on June 12, 2021. Thanks for your time. Earlier this evening, June 5th, 2021, 4 of us were boating at Salt Fork in Ohio. I live less than 10 miles, so I fished and boated out here for years. This evening, 8 p.m., the lake is very busy, several boats in the ski zone. We decided to take a break from the ski zone and headed back into a cove for a few minutes. After going about halfway back into the cove, we all heard an unusual sound come from our back left, which is a very heavily wooded area. It was loud enough to hear over the motor. I shut off the engine so we could figure out what it was. The only way I can describe the sound is like an old mechanical tornado or air raid siren beginning to wind up. The sound had a very unusual pronounced low-end frequency, or bassy in layman's terms. You could literally almost feel the sound. There are no sirens located out here. I have never heard a sound like that at all, or anywhere before. We've all heard stories of Sasquatch being out here, but I'm very skeptical of this kind of stuff and joke about it usually on every outing. I thought it was unusual, but Bigfoot was definitely not my first answer as to what we heard. After we got back home and the kids in bed, I Googled Bigfoot air raid siren and eventually came across the infamous audio clip called the Ohio Howl. It's very close to what we had heard, except ours was much closer. We went camping for a couple of nights near Julian, California, in a location just a couple of miles south of a town adjacent to Highway 79. We arrived on a Friday night, stayed through Sunday afternoon. We were sharing a tent trailer with friends. Both mornings before dawn, I walked my wife over to the nearby porta-potty restroom. Both nights were clear and quite dark with partial moonlight, but the area has a lot of trees, so there are shadows, even though you can see well enough to walk over to the restrooms without a light. The first morning we walked over to the bathroom without any incident. It's very quiet there, especially come the evening. The second morning, probably at about 5:40, I waited for my wife. I very clearly heard a wood knock. It came from north of our location. When my wife came out, I told her what I'd heard and asked her if she had heard it. She did not. We walked back to the tent trailer, got back in bed as the sun was not rising until closer to 7. We were both awake about 15 minutes later and both heard a single whoop sound, this time a bit to the east. Right after the whoop sound, we heard there were blue jays in the trees around us that went nuts, making all kinds of noise for about 20 seconds. Then, all was quiet again. A bit later, still before dark, I got up and kind of kindled the fire a bit outside and decided to take my vehicle up the road to drop some trash off near the campground office. Another friend from a second tent trailer also camping with us up at the time. I told her about the tree knock and the whoop that was heard. When I returned from the quick errand to the trash bin, she told me that she had also heard a tree knock, but this time it was to our west. A few minutes later, I heard 2 more whoops, one from the southeast, then a couple of minutes later, after that to the south. These were not coyotes yipping. Not sure what else to say about this, but it was interesting. On August 26th, around 2:20 a.m., my 2 cousins were driving back from Minnow. They took the back roads to get home faster. They were about 2 to 3 miles from home, on Country Road 7. They said that they were just talking, and noticed on the left side of the northbound lane a large, hairy brown 7 to 8 feet tall figure that was standing there. They said they were going roughly about 50 miles an hour and slowed down a bit. As they passed by it, they tapped on the brake, and the brake lights, they saw it, punched it back home. They said that they were so scared they were going at least 90 miles to get back. As they got to one of my cousin's house, they went up and woke up my uncle, told him they saw Bigfoot. Then, they drove to my house, woke me up. So I said to them, "Yeah, right, like you seen a Bigfoot around here." They were both scared and shaking, so that's when I knew that they saw something. So, I took 2 spotlights, a 5 million and a 3.5 million. My uncle had a 1 million light also. We asked them to show us, in which they both agreed after they calmed down a bit. We left their car and took my aunt's van, headed north. They showed us the spot and I marked by throwing out a full bottle of water. I asked them, which way do you think it was going, and if they seen more. She said that it might have been moving west. So we headed westbound on Country Road 6, just north of White Shield. As we headed about 1 to 2 miles west from Country Road 7, we turned northbound on Country Road 5. We were spotlighting in the cut wheat fields. I was on the passenger side, my uncle was driving. We were both looking around, with the lights, when I picked up bright red reflections of eyes. As I told my uncle to stop, I noticed that this thing was on all fours moving west towards us. Then it stopped, and what looked like it sat down. I mean, it looked like a gorilla from the movies. As we stopped and sat there, we must have been watching it for about 3 to 5 minutes. It seemed unreal to me, but as I started to realize that this is happening, that we don't have gorillas in North Dakota, that is when my uncle noticed 2 more sets of eyes behind the one we were watching. My cousin started screaming and cussing at us to leave and get to the cops and Game and Fish. So, after that, we began to turn around and head back. I noticed it stood up, and that's when I said, "Hurry, let's get up and get Game and Fish out here." When I arrived at my house, my cousin called the BIA. They said they will contact the game warden. My uncle and I told my cousins to tell them that we're going to come back down there and wait for the game warden. My cousin stayed. My cousin's husband wanted to go with us, as we started to turn on Country Road 5. That's when we noticed the smell of urine and old sweet slough odor. It wasn't us. I checked the smell inside the van. It smelled better than outside. We stopped and jumped out, starting to listen. That's when we noticed the truck lights on Country Road 6. It was the game warden. We flashed him down and talked to him, gave all the info, so he said he would check the field out, and left, moving east with all his spotlights. As we talked to my uncle, said to try and call it. So my cousin's husband made a howling sound, and sure enough, another sound came back, a faint bellow southwest of us, about a half a mile. There is no cattle around there, so we began heading in that direction and stopped where we thought the sound was at. We had the windows down and began listening for any sound. There was none, not even crickets or birds or grasshoppers chirping, so we all turned around and left. Stopped the game warden, and we stayed looking around until 7 a.m. that morning. We noticed that there were lots of slough and deep weeds, a place for a good hiding spot. On the next day, we began looking for prints. We found some impressions in the cut wheat field and ditch. The prints were close to about 15.5 inches and about 6 inches wide. We stopped a BIA officer and told him that we found some impressions. He came out there and took some pictures. The footprints pointed in an east direction as we began to track them, and they started to zigzag. We also found 3 other sets that seemed like they were zigzagging around. After 30 or so minutes, we tracked it to a tree row where it seemed that there were spots of cut hay into piles, and pine tree branches 2 inches thick snapped off, the sap still oozing out from the break. The sunflower or tall weeds stem in that spot. There was no tall weeds around that spot. So we walked around and found a slough just at the end of the tree row, about 200 yards away. I had the same stems from the weeds. On the 31st of August, my uncle and I kind of made a path of direction. It looks like they follow sloughs and a small ponds for maybe drinking water. The direction was taking them to Lake Sacagawea, as we tested that theory where we were west of White Shield when we heard a low scream. A dog that lived at a farmhouse started to bark. Where the spot we seen it, to the location we heard it, our theory was correct. On September 4th, since we left them alone for a couple of days, we went to the spot where we thought they should be at. No luck. They weren't there, so that was the end of our search or hunt. Until September 9th, when 6 kids saw a tall black thing running on 2 legs, heading west on BIA 1, just half a mile north of White Shield. I talked to the kids myself, and they said it was running in the field. It was black and on 2 legs. As it crossed, it took 3 steps, and it was on the other side. This was around 9 p.m. and the sun was setting. By the time the kids told, it was dark. My uncle and I drove back there and found nothing. This is the next day, September 10th. We also tried to find paths where this thing had crossed. We are still looking for signs or even better prints. That's all for now. My book, Night Side of Gold, was written from hindsight and remembrance of encounters with Bigfoot during an 8-year mining venture in the Santa Lucia along the coast of Southern California. Now, in the lagunas around Julian, in San Diego County, I have been actively pursuing reports of Bigfoot in these mountains, in the desert below, and most particularly within certain Indian reservations. In February of 1981, I happened to be at the right place at the right time. I met a young native boy who talked openly of his interest in Bigfoot. He had seen him on the reservation and knew the location of the caves where Bigfoot had hid. He would take me there. He guided me up a fearfully storm-wrecked road. My ancient van was not designed for such, nor my senior years to cope. But once started, there was no turning back. Disaster seemed certain, but I would die trying. We reached a small flat. "Park here," my escort said. Now we hiked down a canyon. I hiked ahead rapidly, and I eventually caught up with him, napping under a bush. Below him, a small stream followed a darkened canyon around a bend. I had parked in a bright sunshine in less than a mile. We had now descended into the sunless gloom. The caves are over there, but I am not about to go there. Until my guide refused to enter a taboo area, I had not really believed his story. I knew that no money or incentive on Earth will induce a native to enter taboo ground. "Okay, now we wait. Have a seat," I said to him. "What are we waiting for?" he asked. "To watch. He comes out this time of day and walks around. He drinks from those old rock troughs I showed you by the road. Sometimes he hangs up by that wrecked house where the road loop starts. You in a hurry?" I told him no, but that I was not about to drive back down the road in the dark. We hiked back to the van, which was completely concealed in the brush, until you reached the road. It was dusk when I drove out of the res. After a week of heavy storms had eased up, I sought out my native escort. Unlike before, he was neither friendly or talkative. Briefly, I was then told, "My people are not complaining. Our tribal spokesman is very displeased. You will not be welcome to return, with or without your friends, and trespassers risk being shot." So I backed down for a while, but I was not out. For 3 months, I planned for a return trip. A friend obtained permission from a well-known native to drive up the mountain, just to take pictures, to stay on the road and not wander around the reservation. I had studied the map well, but a certain hunch compelled me to request we never reverse our direction. After a steep turn, we were blocked, but good, by a heavy pickup in the road next to a parked bulldozer. In front stood 5 natives, shoulder to shoulder spanning the road with their backs to us. "Looks like we've got trouble," Escort said, very quietly. He stepped out with a cheery greeting, and, as a Forest Service firefighter, was recognized. The 2 men approached me. "You see Bigfoot this morning?" They knew who I was. No, and I came up here to just shake hands with them. That brought welcomed laughter. Then a statement. "I have seen him. He comes up from the canyon below the flat you just passed. He doesn't come out very often." This was confirmed what my first native guide had told me. The sticky situation was smoothed out, but not to the extent that would continue to explore. I am presently biding my time for the right moment to return. I was deer hunting with a friend for whom I have known and hunted with for years. I was in my tree stand at about 9:15 a.m., and I noticed a shape emerging from the trees to my left. I then realized it was Scott. I noticed that there was something wrong with him, because he was pale white. He was coming up to the ridge extremely quick, and was looking behind him at all times. I mentioned to him, thinking he might have been startled by a big buck, but he let me know real quick that it was not so. Scott stopped at a stump to catch his breath, turned to look behind him once again. At this time, I became concerned. I've never seen him so scared. He finally arrived at my stand, obviously extremely disturbed. I climbed down from my stand and asked him what was wrong. He explained to me that something, which I chuckled at. He told me that something was behind him and got very disturbed with his presence, began to stalk him in a very aggressive manner. He then stood up to see what was walking around him, when all of a sudden, a horrible and terrifying yell shot through his body that shook him. He gathered his pack and proceeded to my stand. We talked and decided to investigate the situation, due to the fact that we were camped about a half-mile away. What we found was very disturbing. Trees snapped in half at 9 to 10 feet tall. Some very deep indentations that were 12 to 14 inches long. Normally, that would be no big deal, except it had not rained for some time. We followed the tracks for 2 miles until they went into extremely dense foliage. I passed this as of the jitters, but the next day, I too was stalked myself. I'm 67, retired RN, and former private pilot with excellent vision. 2015. So I was not mistaken. It was not a bear. We have had a bear here by the deck, so I know what bears look like standing up to reach for the feeder. It was a sunny day. My small Chihuahua mix was out front in her cage. She was barking, so I walked out to the front deck and looked towards the dirt road where she was looking. We sit back, approximately 125 feet from the road. I saw a very black humanoid shape walking on 2 legs going past our driveway. It was half bent over, then straightened up. It had long arms swinging. The head was turned away and appeared to have a very short neck and a roundish head from that angle. I said to myself, that looks like a chimp. I watched it for approximately 12 seconds until it disappeared behind the trees going east. There are spots that I can see through the trees to the neighbor's drive, so I was looking for it to either go up to the drive or continue on the road. When it did not, I walked out to the end of the driveway, approximately 200 feet, with my air horn. There was nothing on the road for some distance, Later in the day, I went out to that area with my small dog. She refused to even walk and was trembling. This was the same dog that almost went through a screen door to attack the bear by our feeder just a few weeks ago. I noticed an area of bent weeds that would have been where the creature had exited our woods, going into a small ditch, then back up to get onto the road before walking past our drive. On the roadside, in the direction that I saw it going, there were 3 barefoot-heeled depressions with faint toe marks, approximately 12 inches long. The area was dry with fine gravel, so not a clear print. The week before, I heard twigs snapping and weeds moving behind my fenced garden. This is approximately 40 feet from the front porch where I often sit. The dog barked. The noise stopped and then started again, so I fired off my air horn, which I always have near after an encounter with a large coy wolf. The cabin sits at about 100 feet above the river. There are many snowmobile and ATV trails, plus the long trail is only about 1/5 miles. It was very wooded and remote. A few homes and camps on our road. My wife and I were camping in the Cleveland National Forest, Mount Laguna area, east of San Diego. The campground is called Burnt Rancheria. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. My wife had woken me up. She needed to use the restroom badly. The restroom was about 50 yards away, and she was afraid to go alone. As I was putting on my shoes, I began hearing sounds like something that reminded me of an axe hitting wood, but louder. It wasn't like somebody was cutting wood, because the sounds were not in rapid succession. They were 2 or 3 seconds apart. In total, I think I heard 4 or 5 of them. I put on my shoes, stepped out of my tent, and kept hearing them, finally realizing that they sounded like knocking sounds described by people who have reported Bigfoot encounters. After about 5 seconds, they stopped. I don't know if this was just because it was my imagination or not. I started to hear echoes of voices. I say voices because it sounded like somebody talking, but at the same time it was gibberish. The next day, my sister-in-law, who was camping with us, began to give us a hard time about all the noise we were making, getting out of the tent and going to the restroom. I asked her if she had heard the knocking sounds. She did. She described them as somebody dropping a heavy rock on plywood. I asked my wife if she had heard them, but she said she was still half asleep and trying not to wet herself. I've seen the show Finding Bigfoot and know what sounds Sasquatch reportedly make, but I never thought I would ever actually hear them myself. This story is as best as I can remember it. I will only use initials of persons involved, but there were several people involved at the time. You can take this story/report however you feel. In the fall of 1971, while I was still in high school, it was close to the high school football homecoming. Several of the students were at Dresser's Ranch preparing for a homecoming float, when several members of the Oklahoma high school football team drove up to the barn, yelling and screaming that they had seen something in the woods on Green Hill Road. They said that even whatever it was bigger than ES, and had grabbed him while he was in the woods using the bathroom. ES was a football player and was well over 6 foot 3 inches tall, weighing around 245 pounds, a huge guy. ES would not get out of the truck. When they got to Dresser's barn, he was white as a sheet and seemed to be in some sort of shock. Another football player, EN, was shaking so bad he couldn't even zip his own pants. Several other football players said they were there when it happened, but did not see anything, except ES running back to where the fire was, passing them, locking himself in the truck. EN jokingly got his spotlight out of his truck to shine it where ES had come from. EN was holding the spotlight in one hand and trying to take a whiz at the same time. EN had said he seen it. A large hairy animal standing about 20 feet from him. ES and EN were the only ones to actually see whatever it was, but they were convincing enough that the others that were there jumped in their vehicles and drove to town, which was only about 5 miles away. Since we have had one of our own teachers at Dresser's barn with us, they came there first. After they told us what had happened, we thought they were pulling our leg, but once we seen the faces of ES and EN, we thought there had to be something to it. So we all jumped in our trucks and cars and headed out to Green Hill Road to see if we could see anything ourselves. Since there was a whole line of cars and trucks going out of town at the same time, the local police seen us and called a highway patrol and county deputy. They thought we were up to no good. Once we got to Green Hill Road, several of us had spotlights and were shining out into the woods where ES had been grabbed. We did not see anything out of place. Then, the highway patrol and the county deputy arrived to try and run us off. They did ask what was going on, so ES and EN told them what they had seen. After that highway patrol trooper and deputy sheriff went out into the woods to look around, just a few minutes later, both came back to the waiting group of the high school students and told us if we knew it was good for us, we would get out of there. They neither confirmed or denied seeing anything. We all left going back to town. At school the next day, the topic of most conversations was the Green Hill Monster. After school, many of us all returned to Green Hill Road to have a look in the daylight. Found was 3 deer, necks broken, guts ripped out. None of the deer had any bullet holes and were intact except for the guts being ripped out. While in infantry training at Camp Pendleton in California, we had dug in on a very large hill and were expecting an enemy force to attack in the night. I had one Marine with me, and to our left were 2 others about 30 yards away. They were also dug in. We had a steep rock-covered area right in front of us. We heard something coming up the side of the mountain. We could hear rocks rolling down the mountain. It came up over the edge, and the Marine, with me, yelled, "Halt!" It stood up right in front of us, about 6 feet away. I could see the outline of this creature, and it was huge. It looked to be about 3.5 feet wide. It had long arms and a pointed head. It was very tall. From the hole we were in, I had to look almost straight up at it. I couldn't believe how big it was. It was so tall, big and wide. I could see the very outline well, but not make out its features. It made no noise, and there was no smell we could detect. It stood there for about 1 minute, then walked between us and the other Marines. I was terrified at the time. My hair was standing up. I tried not to breathe. I had no idea what to expect from it. After it had passed and was out of sight, the 4 of us made sure we had all seen the same thing. Everybody said they were not going to say a thing. I have never before reported this, but I know they exist. My father worked for the Green Lake County Sheriff's Department back in the 1970s. During deer hunting, some hunters had seen a Bigfoot near Manchester, Wisconsin. The Sheriff's Department sent people out with snowmobiles to try and track it. They never found it, but had numerous pictures of the tracks in the snow. My dad showed me the pictures they had up on a bulletin board in their meeting room. My girlfriend and I were standing in a graveyard on a ridge top in Eagle Rock, Virginia. It was December 24th. It was rainy, overcast day at approximately 4:50 p.m. We were paying respect to my family's graves when all of a sudden, we heard a guttural call sound come from about what I estimate to be about 150 yards away, if that far up from the mountain. It was low, it lasted several seconds. There were 3 distinct calls in the initial call. My girlfriend looked at me and said, "What was that?" I began to answer her with an "I'm not sure" response when it called out again. 3 more distinct calls. She said, "Is that a Bigfoot?" And I told her, "I'm not sure. I grew up in the woods and had never heard anything guttural like that before, and I've heard a lot." You could see the fear in her eyes. I looked around and told her, "I'm not sure what it is, but look at all the dogs. They know exactly what it is." There was a very large dog, about 100 yards away over the ridge, that was frozen in place, staring in the direction of the sound. There were 2 other dogs, one on a chain on the porch of a house, and a hunting dog on a chain about 75 yards away from both of us. Both of those dogs were frozen, looking in the direction of the sound. Not one of the dogs barked. The hunting dog was the closest to the sound and was still quiet. My girlfriend said, "What do we do now?" Before those words were finished coming out of her mouth, I was trying to make the same sound back at whatever it was, but I only did one guttural call instead of 3. She said, "Oh my gosh." It was quiet for about 10 seconds after my call. Then it responded with another single one, like I had just done. I thought I had heard something moving. When it responded, a rooster crowed right behind us. And then, the rooster and chickens with it ran off the hillside behind us. My girlfriend wanted to leave and go to my grandfather's, and that sounded like a good idea. However, I wanted to see if I can get close enough so I could see what it was. I convinced her that we were safe in the car. So we got on the gravel road that went up to the water tank farther up the mountain, very close to where the sound had come from. On the way up, when we passed the dogs, they were standing still, looking up the mountain. When we got to the water tank, I wanted to get out, but my girlfriend had asked me not to. I listened to her, and frankly happy that I did, since I didn't have anything for protection. I had the windows down, hoping to hear it again. There was silence, and the dogs began barking at us. That told me that whatever had scared them must have gone then, so we left. The hunting dog that was standing still when we passed it was up the hill, was spinning around and flipping. He was going so fast trying to get at our car. I didn't see anything, but heard much. 2 years ago, while camping at the lake, without permission, we were walking at the southwestern inflow to the lake, which is a seasonal creek. The water level of the lake was high due to the El Niño rains, and the creek extended out from the lake, covering the dirt road with about 2 feet of water. 3 of us were returning from climbing Boundary Peak when we had to take our shoes off to wade across. Our footprints were clear and distinct in the silty, sandy bottom. However, near the other side, we saw a set of footprints that looked like somebody had walked into the water and then back out. These footprints were about the same size as ours. However, they were blurred and had kind of fuzzy marks all around. They had not been there when we had crossed the same spot an hour before. We all commented about how weird they looked. Later that evening, when we sat around our campfire, a U.S. Border Patrol agent stopped by to chat. He had been dragging some old tires along the dirt roads near the border so that he could return later to see if any illegal aliens had crossed the border at that point. We told him about the weird tracks we had seen, and he said, "Oh yeah, we call him Littlefoot, because the prints aren't big enough to be a Bigfoot." Nobody's seen him, though. The agent went on to say that everybody in his office just thought it was a Mexican with hairy feet. I was in junior high school for Crew Junior High. It no longer exists. I was riding on a school bus on a back road in Greensville after competing in a junior high basketball game with my teammates. We had lost the game, so my coach had told everybody on the bus ride he wanted no talking on the ride home, back to Nottoway. Well, almost everybody on the bus was asleep, or trying to get sleep because we could not talk. That is when I saw it. About 75 yards to 100 yards away from the road, down a hill was a cornfield with a scarecrow on a wooden cross in the middle of it. I saw out of the foggy window, because it was early winter, a huge figure standing like a man with hair all over it. I could tell it had hair, because it was thick and long from under its arms. It had to be about 8 to 9 feet tall. Its head was at its chest area, and the scarecrow of the wooden cross. It was huge and massive. It appeared to be looking at the scarecrow. As the bus drove by, I sat up in the seat, trying to get a better look out the window, because I had the window cracked to get some air. I yelled at my coach and everybody on the bus, "Did you see that?" They all laughed and joked on me. I tried to get my coach to turn around and go back, but he was so mad at the team for losing the game, he just told everybody to be quiet and not say another word, or we would be running laps the next day. So I didn't say anything. What I saw that night has haunted me for a long time, until today, when I got a text message from my brother about an article he read from you guys. It was a Bigfoot sighting near the Brunswick counties. My brother knows of the stories that I've told and wanted me to know that I'm not the only one to have seen something like this in my own hometown area. I live now in Virginia, But where I live now is only about 45 minutes away from where this happened, where the story of the Fort Pickett sighting my brother had read happened, and about an hour and 30 minutes from Greensville. I'm an investigator here in the mountains of western North Carolina. Having lived in the mountains all my life, I've enjoyed hunting, hiking, and mountain things since I was a boy. So, I'm very comfortable with being in the woods and, for years, have taken late-night drives to go see wildlife. For the past few years, I have been taking late-night drives to my research that are good weather nights. It was Tuesday, June 23rd, 2015. The weather was good. I decided to take a late drive to my research area. I was still on the main road, taking my time, and within 5 miles of my destination. I was not really thinking about Sasquatch, but just enjoying the late-night drive and some music. As I was rounding a slight turn on the road, I see a coyote on the right side. I slowed slightly as my eyes panned back to the road, and then I saw to my left. The creature just left off the road and behind the guardrail. My truck's side lights hit it just briefly where I could get a good look at it. My sighting was brief, but I did get a very good look at it. I could not believe what I saw. I went up the road and turned around as it caught me off guard. I did not even think to stop. I was trying to talk myself out of what I saw. Could it have been something else? The area on the left was very green, so I thought I might have seen something else, maybe. As I approached the area, I stopped and searched up and down for anything looking reddish-brown in color. Since it was June in the mountains, everything was very green, but nothing was brown at all, bringing proof to me that it was a creature that I saw. It's very hard to describe the feeling that I had at the time of the sighting, and after. I was feeling very strange and could not believe what had just happened. This is what I saw. Just past the guardrail and slightly off the bank of the road. A reddish-brown upright figure. It had its back to me, and I could see from the back and upper legs behind the guardrail. I'm very sure it was on 2 legs with the most impressive width. The shoulders were very large, the head slightly forward with no neck type look. The waist to shoulders made a very impressive V, larger than any man I've ever seen. The hair was slightly long, and had another color of gray-white underneath it, with a main coat of reddish-brown. Some of the back hair was shaggy looking. The left shoulder was slightly up and the arm was curled. The sighting was brief, but I got a very good look at it, and I could tell it was very tall. After turning around and checking the sighting area for my truck, I pulled off about 150 yards down below on the side of the road. I got out of my truck to listen for about 10 minutes. Then, I did a howl call, immediately getting a response from a pack of coyotes. They were very close and below the road, about 150 yards away. This would be the side of the road the creature was also on. I tried driving back up the road to see if anything was there. Maybe about 100 yards above, when I saw the creature, I saw a wild boar feeding on the side of the road. Later on, I stopped at an overlook about a quarter mile past the sighting and made yet another howl call. I got another response from an owl being close to the parking lot. Then, just after this response, I heard another owl call in the valley below, towards the sighting area. It was the loudest owl call I have ever heard. I have heard many different owl calls, but this one was very strange. The volume of it was very strange as well. I stayed in the area for 4 more hours with really nothing happening. The next afternoon, me and a friend went back to the general area of the sighting, looking for tracks. We only found disturbances, as the ground was very rocky, steep and hard, not really friendly for walking around on. I cannot fully explain my feeling after the sighting. I really noticed that I was feeling strange, and when I had gone to get a drink a few miles away in the store, I noticed I was sweating and feeling odd. I think that I was slightly in a state of shock. I feel like this was due to me seeing something that I had not seen ever before, something that was hard for me to process. I have been hunting in the woods all my life. I've seen every animal in our area in many situations. Trust me, I've not seen anything like this before. I've related this story only to very few people over the years, for fear of ridicule by my peers and doubt that anybody would ever really believe me. Anyway, in May of 1982, while serving on active duty at Camp Pendleton, California, I was temporarily assigned to a staff of Marines supervising a youth program, consisting of a rigorous series of 2-week-long mini-boot camps for teenage boys. Camp Pendleton is flanked by the Pacific on its western flank, and by the Cleveland National Forest on its northeastern flank. 3 different mountain ranges intersect the base itself. I am very familiar with every nook and cranny on its over 200,000 acres of mountains, ridges, ravines, canyons, trails, backroads, and the likes. Anyway, on one particular calm night, after a long grueling day of forced marches, displays and demonstrations, we took all 300 boys up to a bivouac site for the night. The site is situated open meadow shelf above the infantry training school at San Onofre, 52 area. The boys were exhausted, yet eagerly setting up their shelter halves. They began to get a little too loud, so I began to quiet them and bed them down for the night. The rest of the staff was situated about 35 meters away, up on a little knoll that overlooked the boys. However, I was not aware that the staff had already bedded down, and that I was the last one up, except for radio watch, which was half asleep too. It had become dark, with the exception of a bit of starlight, which gave me a very good range of vision. Finally, I succeeded in getting the kids in the sack. Then, I stood for a few moments to ensure all was secure and that not one peep could be heard, and none could be. As I turned facing west, looking towards the closest edge of the perimeter, I noticed a tall, dark, bulky figure standing 15 meters beyond the last tent, or 20 meters from where I stood. We seemed to be staring at each other, but it's hard to say. I cannot make out any facial definition, but I had a strong gut feeling that it was checking me out real good, since I was the only thing moving around. I could feel my heart begin to pound, and my entire body felt like it wanted to anchor. There was no doubt somebody or something very odd and dangerous standing there, looking at me. I mean, this thing was tall and wide at the shoulders. I used my peripheral vision to make sure I wasn't seeing things, but it only confirmed what I already knew. It gently and slightly moved its upper body left and right, ever so slowly, as though looking around to its front, surveying the area. It was an easy 8 feet tall. Like I had mentioned previously, all I could make out was its massive silhouette, no real detail features. It had very broad shoulders, little to no neck, dark, and looked very powerful. I decided to go get a flashlight out of our vehicle on the top of the knoll and let staff know what was going on. I began to cautiously and quietly step backwards to prevent whatever it was from charging or coming. I continued to keep an eye on the dang thing, which just remained in the same spot. Almost halfway up the knoll, I had finally lost sight of it, but continued to move slowly, still trying to locate it. From atop the knoll, it was very difficult to see anything clearly, at least outside the fringe of perimeter, due to the light, or lack thereof. I walked back down to the tents, scanning the area with the light, but didn't see anything like I had before. The figure had obviously moved. So instead of waking anybody up, I sat up for a while, waited to see what and if anything would happen. I also hoped the darn thing wouldn't pop up behind me. We were all unarmed. It would have been worse, and maybe a calamity, if I had pushed the panic button and waken everybody up. After all, we were in charge of nearly 300 young street kids without any formal training. Out in the open, and I didn't need the grief if nothing I said or described could have been verified. Thankfully, nothing else occurred that night. In the morning, just before daybreak, I beelined for the spot where I saw the thing standing. There was nothing there. Nothing. Not a pole, a bush, a tree, a reed. I mean, nothing that could have simulated what I had seen. We were situated on a flat, clear, open ground with the exception of the knoll and a tree line about 60 meters away and a mountain behind, all of which I knew existed, and had seen backdropped way beyond the figure the previous evening. The ground was grassy, but was already pretty well matted down and rutted by the constant foot and vehicle movement in that trading area. I know that what I saw was not normal. I know it wasn't a hoax. I know it wasn't the kids. They were well accounted for. I trust my judgment. I'm now 46 years old, still having perfect vision. I know it was not any of the staff. I'd seen all of them sleeping when I got uphill. At the time, I had nearly 11 years of active military service in the infantry, and had done plenty of night OPs, observation posts. To know how to use my eyes in the dark, and to know the difference between a bush and a moving object. This was big and real. Oh, and this thing was very quiet. I never once heard it make a sound. Shortly after lying down for the night, during a backpacking trip in the Nantahala wilderness, we heard a loud howl that lasted around 15 seconds, with a change of tone for the last few. This howl could not have been mistaken for any other animal, and sounded very similar to recordings of other howls. In the next 2 hours, we both heard random whoops. The next day while hiking, we came across very interesting signs along the trail. The first was spotting what looked like a game trail that crossed the hiking trail. Upon closer inspection, the tracks in the well-traveled trail clearly were not made by a bear or any other four-legged animal. The footprints on the trail had left deep impressions where the heel contacted the ground, and footprints much larger than my foot were also seen. The distance between the tracks was approximately 5 feet on average, and the depth of the tracks, where the heel had sunken down, was 3+ inches. The ferns and weeds in the trail that had been pressed down were still green and flat, which made me think the tracks had been made with the past couple of days. I followed the trail in both directions, for around 150 yards. The footprints remained consistent in both directions. After traveling the hiking trail further down the ridgeline for close to a mile, I spotted another trail that crossed the hiking trail. The footprints here were identical to what we saw at the first trail. I took pictures to gauge the depth and length of the prints. I found a stick on this trail that had blood on it. I regret not keeping it for evidence to see what type of blood it was. The location of both trails had some similarities. Both were located in the gaps along the ridgeline, and there was an unusually high amount of limbs and trees wedged in tree forks at both sides. One other strange observation made along the trail was finding 3 large white mushrooms placed upside down near the trails. One of these was on a rock, and another was found on the trail while following the footprints. The area where we found these signs was the direction where we had heard the howls the night before. My friend and I had been searching for a place called Dickerson Quarry in Dickerson, Maryland, and had just located it on a map. We had to park on some railroad tracks by the aqueduct and walked through some very dense sticker bushes and overgrowth to find the place. To describe the quarry, it is located in the middle of the woods. It's about 75 yards long and about 30 yards wide, with very tall cliffs, about 50 to 80 feet tall in some places. However, there are a few places where you can walk down to the water's edge. As we were approaching the quarry, we heard this very loud screeching sound coming from about 25 yards away in the overgrowth itself. It was very loud, and it actually startled us when it first started. The only way to describe the sound would be to say it sounded like a pig getting slaughtered. We stopped walking, waited, but it stopped, whatever it was. We continued walking and found the quarry, hearing the strange sound several more times, always coming from a different place. We made a survey and located a place to go down to the water's edge to sit and rest. As we made our way around the quarry, we heard the screaming again, actually coming from the area where we wanted to go. We were not too alarmed though, being curious and stupid. We made it to the water's edge and sat down, began to look around and check the place out. I had picked up a stick off the ground, got out my pocket knife and began to carve on the wood. Suddenly, there was a very large splash in the water. It sounded like a person had just jumped in, but when I looked up, I could see ripples in the water where something had just gone in. Figuring it was a rock falling from the cliffs, we began talking again. About 5 minutes elapsed, and we heard another splash. This one bigger, and it was very far away from the edge. So I'd asked my friend, "Did you throw something in?" He told me no, and he was looking at me. We looked around to see if anybody was there, and we didn't, but there was nobody else anywhere. We sat for about 5 minutes, talking, and then heard another big splash. And neither of us saw what made it, but the disturbance in the water was so big, we guessed it had to have been something big. We started to think that somebody was in the woods and didn't want us trespassing. They were trying to scare us off. However, as we began to really think, we became aware there was no way anybody could throw out any rock that big that far. We made the choice to go ahead and leave. As we were climbing up and out of the quarry, another splash came from very near where we had been sitting, also sounding very big. We reached the top and began to make our way to the car. We only walked about 20 feet when something came crashing through the tree branches, hitting the ground near us very hard. It sounded like a 20-pound rock hitting the ground. At that point, we both stopped, walking, turned and really looked into the hard woods. Neither of us saw anything, but we stood there listening. I swear, I have never heard the woods more quiet in my life. We began walking, and the objects being thrown at us started to get a lot more accurate. I remember saying to my friend, "What is going on?" His response was to tell me to go, go, go. We took off running, reached our only real obstacle, a creek, about 10 feet wide where we had to cross on a log. I went first, and he was close behind. As we're halfway across the log, something landed in the creek, about 5 feet from me. It had to be about the size of a paint bucket. I didn't see if it was a rock, or what it was, but it was big. At that point, I jumped for it, hit the ground running with my friend right on my tail. Neither of us looking back. I have never really felt scared like that, but that day, I had the thought that we might meet something that was beyond nature, and not live to tell about it. Our journey into the woods took about 30 minutes due to the high growth of pricker bushes. Our journey took about 30 minutes. We reached the car, and only after the adrenaline had worn off did we both realize we were both bleeding nicely from running top speed through summer overgrowth. At the time, I didn't know about the connection between the rocks being thrown at us and the screaming to a Bigfoot. It sounds like a classic case. I've only been back a few times since then, and only in the winter where I can see for 100 yards. I was 17 and had an 11:30 curfew. I had left my girlfriend's house a little later than I should have. I was in a hurry to get home. I traveled Howell Hill Road to Teal Hollow Road. On Teal Hollow Road, I was speeding down a long straightaway and saw something on the side. I thought it was a deer or cow at first, so I began to slow. As I got closer, it stood up. As I passed it, I was still going fast, about 55 or 60. I then thought it was a person who had crashed their car, so I hit my brakes. By this time, I was past it. I stopped in the road, about 100 to 200 yards past it. When I put the car in reverse to back up, I could see that it had walked into the road behind me. I probably got within 25 to 30 yards of it, and I realized it was much larger than a person. It was dark, so I did not have a great description, but it scared me. I threw the car in drive and floored it. I drove like a bat out of heck until I got to Highway 64. When I got home, I was still shaking and still had tears in my eyes. I do not know what I saw, but it was big. It looked to be about 7 feet tall, almost half the width of my car. 20 years have passed and I still will not drive that road anytime close to dark. I get cold chills every time I think about what had happened. It scared me, whatever it was. I was sitting in my mother's kitchen with two of my nieces and my mother when I happened to look out her back door. I clearly saw a very tall, approximately 8 feet tall creature moving on two legs at a very rapid pace through the weeds, bordering on her yard. I yelled, "What is that?" One of my nieces, standing near the door, whirled around, also seeing the creature. After a few seconds of stunned silence, we all went into the backyard, saw the creature, now in the yard itself, dash behind a storage building. I remember being very afraid, as was everybody else. We did not pursue whatever this was. As I said, this creature was walking on two legs, was around 7 feet tall, covered with very dark brown or black hair. The creature was walking at a stunningly rapid pace, its shoulders hunched, as this thing was moving away from us. We could not see any facial features, but the head appeared to be rounded. We did not see this thing anymore and assumed it had stepped over a fence behind the storage building and proceeded into the fields and woods. We were struck with how rapidly this thing was moving. We're amazed that it had eluded us with such apparent ease. When first spotted, the creature was maybe only 100 feet from the back door. When observed in the yard itself, it was maybe 150 feet away. We were too shaken to look for tracks and were actually afraid to go into the yard for a long time afterwards. "25 years ago, 1979, I heard the most awful and terrifying screams for 3 nights in a row. We had just built a 2-story addition which is situated further back on a lot, about 150 feet into the woods from the street. This area was considered suburban, but was fairly rural at the time. There are houses built along the street that are on lots that are roughly 3/4 to 1 acre. We own several acres of heavily wooded land, and our house sits back on the lot further than others. This section of woods is bordered by 3 state highways and was about 1 mile length by 1.5 miles width of woods and some farmland fields. At the time, there were only 2 dead-end streets that penetrated this section of woods. Another country road separates this section on the west with a state park nearby. This park is several hundred acres of lakes and heavily wooded areas. The area is now filled with housing development. It was July and very hot, 90+ degrees. The peepers were very loud. Each evening, between 2 and 3:30 a.m., an extremely loud howling, screaming sound would start far away. As it came closer, the screams lasted for 30 seconds each and occurred every 1 to 2 minutes. You could hear bushes and branches being swept out of the way, with loud crunching and breaking sounds and screams that would get louder in intensity. The woods of the time were covered with thick vines and bramble that were about 5 feet high. It was very difficult to walk through any section of woods that was not cleared. You just didn't stroll through the woods, especially in the pitch black. When this thing came closer, all the peepers and night sounds completely ceased. The sound was so loud in volume that it actually caused you to freeze. I mean, it ran your blood cold. I remember laying in bed, not wanting to investigate because whatever it was big, and I did not want to find out what it was. It was not the sound of a bear, a mountain lion, or a wounded deer. The sound had a human quality about it, and was like it was searching for something, and had a sense of pain or distress about it. It would travel parallel through the woods, about 100 feet behind my house. On the 3rd night, I got up immediately and waited for this thing to get closer. I have a switch in the bedroom. I would turn on some roof-mounted floodlights that would shine in the backyard. We did not have a deck or anything at the time, and the woods were about 25 feet behind the house. This thing was crashing through the woods when it was right behind the house. It gave out this huge, loud moan. I was looking out the window with all the inside lights out, and I turned on the floodlights. The screams stopped, and there was silence for about 5 seconds. Then, it crashed through the woods, away from the house very quickly, opposite the direction it came from. You could hear the crashing of a 2-footed creature. I heard the crashing sounds for about another minute. Then it faded and was quiet. I was pretty spooked, so I went downstairs and started turning on all the lights and outside lights. I noticed that all my neighbors were turning on their outside lights as well. This was unusual. Nobody left outside lights on, and there were no street lights in this section of street. There were at least 4 other houses that turned their lights on. I contemplated whether to call the police or not. The next day, while mowing the lawn, My elderly neighbor across the street came over and said, "Dave, did you hear those sounds last night? I have heard them for several nights and almost called the police. If I hear it again, I'm calling them." I never heard anything like that in my life. I agreed, and it was good that somebody else had confirmed the incident to me. All these years, I've only told close friends of the story, and the kidding I take as unmerciful. But I know to this day what I heard was absolutely real. I forgot about it for many years until I saw some Bigfoot documentary in the early 1990s. They played a recording, and when I heard it back, it brought back the whole incident. It was almost identical to the sound. I had played the sound recordings on various websites and would have to say it was very close to the Ohio or Pennsylvania recordings. I have never heard anything after 1979 and did not see anything. Perhaps others have given reports from this area, and this report may be helpful. I'm being truthful. I do not drink or do any non-prescription drugs. I am also a church administrator in a Bible non-denominational church. It was a mild day, and I decided to take a walk in the woods. After traveling about 5 to 10 minutes down a woodsy road, I heard 3 deliberate and distinct knocks, which emanated 50 yards away from inside the brush off to my left. It stopped dead in my tracks. I have read many incidents on the BFRO and could not believe what I was hearing. I composed myself and found what I considered a sturdy stick and struck a large pine tree close by in the same manner as I just heard. It took about 5 seconds, but a reply came back, only 2 deliberate knocks this time. A couple of seconds later, another sound came from a direction parallel to the first, but about 50 yards apart. This sound was like a big tree being struck, but with the stick breaking on impact. When the stick broke, it sounded like it had a girth of a couple inches. I struck my tree 3 more times, but nothing more happened. Let me add that as I was strolling down this trail, I was smoking a cigar, and the wind was blowing into the direction that the knocks came from. I continued down the trail, which takes you to the edge of a pond. While exploring there, I found an interesting thing. Lying on the ground was what looked like 3-foot wooden club, with the jagged end where the roots would be. It looked like something that you would see in a caveman picture. There were also 2 holes in the ground, one next to a tree, the hole about 12 inches in diameter, and close to 20 inches deep on the other about 5 feet away from the tree, 3 to 4 inches in diameter, and only 5 inches deep, with the club laying on its side and the small end partially in that hole. I believe that this club dug both holes because of the way the end was well-rounded and embedded with dirt, but I do not understand why. I decided to go back the next day for photographs. I brought a yardstick with me to get these measurements. When returning the next day, I discovered a good-sized pile of feces on the trail 15 feet away from the tree that I had knocked on. Nothing unusual. I did take a few pictures of various other things as well, which may or may not be relevant. What or who made those knocks, I will probably never know. But be clear on this, they were distinct, clear, timed, and deliberate. Of that, I'm sure. I never know how to put this into words, especially because I'm the last person who would believe that it was actually happening. But now, after years of living with it, I finally understand the situation at hand. So, I have lived alone, in a very desolate area, on a secluded part of land north of Seattle. It's kind of by some islands, but I'm not going to go into too many specifics. Just know that it's pretty desolate, and I live in my own cabin. It's actually more than a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. There's hardly cell phone service out here. It's pretty spotty. It's so remote that it's only on some maps. Anyway, I'm out here for peace of mind and quiet, to get away from all the hustle and bustle of the city. I'm technically what you would call a hermit. It would be nice if that was the case, though. But in reality, it's kind of this cold, dark paradise where I'm more likely to be terrorized than find any sense of calm. At least, that's how this experience has made me feel. I've been living out here for about a year and a half now, right around the start of the pandemic. It's been a rough ride, I'm not gonna lie. Being out here alone is peaceful at first, but it can be quite eerie sometimes. I don't have any children. I don't have a spouse. A lot of my family lives in a different state, so it's enabled me to really just live by myself. I've always been the type of person who's never really afraid of much, and I attribute that to my upbringing in a small southern town. This is where I was taught stranger danger, and monsters under the bed were just stories for children to keep from wandering too far off. I even remember my mom reading things, I guess to prepare me for this sort of thing. So the first time I noticed something was really wrong was shortly after moving out here. I woke up one night to this pounding on my house. Then, I heard the sound of something sharp scraping against the side of my cabin. When I opened the door to look out, there was nothing there. Convinced I was just dreaming it all, I went back and lied down. I didn't hear anything for quite a while after. Now, at some point, I remember hearing this heavy breathing, which made me feel incredibly uneasy. I simply brushed it all off, thinking it was just my mind trying to be wackadoodle on me. Later on, I would go to cut firewood for myself, and would constantly feel this lingering sensation that I was being watched. Nobody was around to my knowledge, and a quick scan of my surroundings proved just that. I figured that it was just my mind screwing with me, so I went about my day. One time, I had gone to the store. I had to take my dog with me. He was the only thing that would keep me from getting lonely while being out there by myself. The dog that I had, the one dog that I loved and cherished dearly, was actually sadly shot and killed shortly after moving here. But that's a different story. When my dog, Oscar, came with me, things really began to become apparent. The night was brisk, and I had gotten lost on the way back, getting hopelessly turned around without a compass or a phone. At least, that had good reception. As I stated, it was incredibly spotty. Some spots were completely dead, while others would give you the hope of a bar or two. And I was still incredibly new to the surrounding areas, so I was still learning. After pulling off, trying to figure out what to do, movement caught my eye, and I look over. That's when I see this large man shadow moving swiftly towards my truck from the tree line. I yell an exclamation that's probably not appropriate to repeat, and my dog is going crazy, barking up a storm. I throw the truck in drive and whip out of that pull-off. I didn't see where this thing went, but it gave me a really, really bad feeling. Once I got home, I realized just how much it had scared me. After that incident, things did calm down for a while, and I began to believe that there's no such thing as ghosts or monsters out there, that it was all in my head. Maybe I really was just going crazy. Everything seemed fine, until sometime later, I hear these really strange noises coming from outside my window. Now keep in mind, I'm living in a cabin, and it's kind of located in this small little, I guess you can call it mountain, but it's not really a mountain. The surrounding area is thick forest, and it's pretty pitch black at night. I hear these strange sounds, and so I'm thinking to myself, what animal could this be? It sounds like a large animal, scratching against something, so I'm thinking bear. The thing is, it was pitch black outside at the time of this happening. There's no streetlights or anything in sight. So I look out my window to try and find some sort of telltale sign of what could have made the noise. And I met with two large glowing eyes staring back at me. These were yellow, and they kind of emitted their own glow, the way an animal's does when headlights shine directly onto it. Think like a deer. I go into action mode, throw on my boots and grab my rifle, storming outside to blow this thing's brains out. I get outside, and I hear this thing growl tremendously from the dark. It sounds like a lion. Half angry and half terrified, I'm not having it. I raise my rifle and I take 3 shots into the dark in the direction of said creature. I hear this horrible scream like you could never imagine, and this thing running off, crashing through the trees while screaming. It was horrifying. I ran back in my cabin, figured I best hold down the fort in case more come back. I could hear this thing screaming for minutes afterwards, getting in farther and farther into the distance. At some point it stopped. I was terrified. I called my uncle, telling him what had happened. He kept me on the phone for almost an hour, asking me what happened in minute detail, trying to figure out if this could have just been my imagination or something more. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, I knew better. I do get some good reception in some certain spots. But anyway, after that phone call, I knew something was going to happen tonight. Something really bad. Now, this cabin is also kind of on a dead-end road. The only way in or out of this place are pretty much hiking trails at the end of the road, unless you want to take the main dirt road. So, I decided to set up some traps around with my headlamp for whatever might be calling. I set them up all outside, bear traps and other fun tricks. The feeling of something bad to happening lingered for a while, but never actually anything happened. The night passed. This was easily one of the most terrifying nights of my life. I was so tired from not sleeping the night before, but my adrenaline kept me awake. After that night, I decided to just assume that everything out here in the woods is trying to kill me and treat it as such. Now, it's been about a year since this kind of stuff happened. I'm doing better now than I have then. I don't really believe in Bigfoot or any of that kind of stuff, but after everything I've been through out here, I wouldn't be surprised if it was real. After all the things I've heard and saw while living out here alone, I'm beginning to believe that there is some kind of monster in the woods. I lost my faith in everything, really, after what happened. I'm going to try and get back into a more positive mindset. Maybe one day, somebody can stumble across this story and hopefully figure out what I saw out there in the woods for themselves. There's one thing I can say for certain, and there is nothing that you can refute. There's some animal I have never heard of in my life outside the cabin that night. That much is certain. This was around 2011 to 2012. Me and a few friends hiking together had what we can only call was a Bigfoot experience. I will state that we had never believed in Bigfoot before this encounter. We have no interest in the paranormal or anything of the supernatural nature. Never have. Before this, we were actually the type to mock those who believe in ghosts and Bigfoot. This was completely eye-opening for us, and proved to us there is more out there than meets the eye. This is our story. The 4 of us were hiking in the woods in southern Ohio. We had been hiking for 3 hours at this point, deciding to stop and eat lunch after getting a good start from the morning. We set our food down and immediately continued hiking after eating. It was roughly 1 p.m. in the afternoon. One of us saw that there was some sort of animal in the distance. It had really long arms and was kind of walking over like a monkey. It kind of appeared to be walking on all 4s, but wasn't. It was just leaning over. At first, we kind of thought it was a man, maybe just dinking around out here. We weren't really sure. It looked funky, but we could even tell from the distance, judging by the proportions of this animal, it was not a bear. And then within seconds, I think we all came to the same conclusion. This wasn't a man, or some person pulling a prank out here. This was something else. Although, in the moment, it didn't register as Bigfoot. Then, this thing noticed us almost instantly. I say instantly, but it was more like 5 seconds. As soon as we stopped gawking at it, it immediately stopped and began throwing what I would call a temper tantrum, and then start charging toward us, beating its chest violently and swinging its arms wildly, all while making this indescribable yelping, hollering sound. It was unreal. Our instincts just took over, and without even thinking, we all began sprinting off, away from this animal. While one friend sprinted in another direction, I followed the other friend, sprinting in the opposite direction, but both heading to the same point. We did not stop running for a good 20 minutes. We ran until we reached a small clearing, where all of us collapsed, remaining very quiet and calm. We could not hear anything. I remember it being so silent that the woods around us even had gone completely silent, whereas right after lunch, birds were chirping. The forest was alive with noise and sounds. This was eerie. It's like we were in Silent Hill or something. We immediately began relaying what we had just seen and heard back to each other. It then hit us. This was no ordinary animal we saw out here. This was something else entirely. To give an accurate description of what we saw that day, it was ugly. It kind of reminded me in the face of maybe a baboon mixed with a man. The face had that kind of elongated thing going on with it, like baboons do, but just without the blue and red coloring. Deep set-in eyes like a baboon that were much more striking and yellow. But its face was angry. The mouth was full of sharper teeth. Again, not like monkey teeth. The face kind of looked more humanoid than a monkey does. Still very similar. The head, unlike a baboon, was kind of more coned and pointed. I guess more rounded. The body itself was large, like a football player or a bodybuilder. Covered in thick hair. Very similar to that you would see on a bear, actually. It looked like an extremely large man with exceptionally large arms. If I had to guess a height, I would say 9 to 10 feet tall. I mean, there is no understating how big this thing was. It was huge. Now, could you kindly tell me what I saw that day? I remember it as if it were yesterday. The very first time I ever saw a Bigfoot. I was a young man, just having graduated from high school, and I decided to spend my summer exploring some of the backcountry, taking in all nature had to offer me. One particular afternoon, I found myself wandering through a very dense section of vegetation of forest that ran alongside a river. It was there that my own eyes locked on with a creature of unlike anything I had ever seen. Truth be told, upon seeing this thing for the first time, as it was something I had never seen in my life, I felt the drive to run, and at the same time, I was shocked by what I was seeing and looking at. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life. I hadn't seen me yet, and was crouched on the other side of the river, drinking water, the exact same way a person would with their hand, cupping it and sipping water. My first thoughts was this was some sort of large indigenous person drinking water, until it looked up at me. Instantly, I realized this was no human, even though it kind of reminded me of a Neanderthal. Its face, though, had black eyes. It immediately stood up, turned around and walked off. As it did, it kind of had this expression on its face like it was scoffing at me in annoyance. Or so that's how I interpret it. I was in shock at this, and returned back home immediately. Of course, I never could tell anybody what I saw. Nobody would believe me. Later on, I found friends and connections that were very into Bigfoot, where I got to share my actual encounter. What's interesting is Bigfoot is usually supposed to be reported as pretty big. This wasn't. It was probably about the same height I was, about 6 feet tall. I'm guessing it wasn't fully grown. I know this is all very difficult to believe, especially since I don't have any evidence or pictures. But it's what happened the day when I approached this thing in the river, in the forest near my house. Only those who have actually witnessed these things even know how they walk and act, so they could probably understand. Sometimes there's no doubt you'll know them if they're there. They hide pretty well, But for whatever reason, this one didn't mind keeping itself out in the open. I wondered if I had maybe just startled it, and that's why it was annoyed. Anyway, take my word for it. Bigfoot are real. It was either late 1976 or early 1977, when not quite 15 years old, me and my friend Kurt were riding our bikes from a fishing trip on the White River, 6 miles east of Cascade, Arkansas. It seemed much longer than that unpleasant trip, as Kurt and I were stopped at a creek crossing when we see something moving like a tall man in the woods, right along this divided road from the river. The thing was quite dark brownish, very black too, hairy, having big muscles with long arms and legs. It looked up at us and decided to throw some mud over in our direction, along with some rocks. Kurt even mentioned that it growled, but I didn't hear anything. I just see it reach down and grab some mud and rocks and throw it off in our direction, then bang something large like a piece of wood against the tree trunk. We jumped on our bikes and took off riding hard for home. As soon as we get there, we told everybody about what had happened. No one really believed us. Sometime after that event, though, my mother's sister or my aunt called to tell her that she'd seen one of them in the woods near the house. She would not or could not describe it to my mother, who dismissed her talking about such nonsense as a childish imagination, or simply a misidentification of a bear. But now, I wonder if Kurt and I were seeing a female picking mites up from under her arms, or maybe somehow stumbling upon her after emerging from the river. For years, I never thought about what we saw that evening. But one day, in 2001, I saw an Animal Planet special on Bigfoot. They showed actors' depictions of what this creature might look like using CGI and how it behaved. This was strange because when I first saw the thing, it was running away from us into the woods, directly across from where we were standing with our bikes. So, based on its direction of travel and the location of where we were at, I could get a fairly accurate estimate on how tall it was. This thing had to have been large though, at least 8 or 9 feet tall, based on my estimation. If we were within 30 to 40 yards closer of this thing, we would no doubt have been too close for comfort. We could see that it was very hairy. Like many people who have seen Bigfoot, I can assure you that its appearance is nothing like any man or woman of this planet. This creature is much more powerful and has different behavior than any animal found in the wild. The only way to describe what we would have saw is something akin to a Neanderthal with long arms and legs. My encounter was a little bit different from most Bigfoot sightings. When I saw this thing, it didn't seem to be so aggressive. I want to tell my story about seeing Bigfoot. This way, maybe I could help educate others on what they look like, so more people will believe that these actually exist and are out there somewhere, since many people still consider us crazy for really believing they exist. And if nothing else, maybe somebody could figure out why some of us have seen them, but know that not everybody who claims to see them is lying. It was early fall of 1989, and my buddies and I were camping at the river near the hot springs in Northern California. I was pretty young, 13 and going into 8th grade, so I was still a kid at heart. Now, I was a pretty naughty kid, because with my friends, we had snuck alcohol and also cigarettes, which we were indulging in quite a bit. We weren't really concerned about anything else but having fun, since our families were all back home, miles away from where we were camping. We didn't have to worry about getting busted. During our stay there, we began hearing what sounded like heavy footsteps, walking through the trees behind us and around the river. This was later on at night, so we just chalked it up to maybe some drunk hillbillies out there or something. It freaked us out, but we thought we had safety in numbers. After hearing it walk behind us for a while, we decided to try and talk to them, since we thought it was funny. We yelled out things and talked smack to them. We were pretty entertained in our inebriated state, but whatever. The sounds ceased. It turned out that nobody was there, but it sounded like footsteps coming closer and closer. Even branches and stuff were being broken. That's when we began to feel more and more unsafe. We had our flashlights with us, of course, but by the time everybody in our camp had already ran inside their tents and set them up tight, nobody really used them. I remember that night like it happened yesterday, looking up from the bottom of my sleeping bag with my tent open and still hearing the noises. Then, I see something big looking down at me. I don't remember if it was standing up or sitting down, but I remember this ugly, hairy face, almost like it had been shaved or something. It was strange looking. Its eyes were huge. I could see them very clearly, off the slow glow of what was ever left of the burning embers in the distance. They looked like big black marbles, just as the light reflected off of them, looking into me. I shined my flashlight up at this thing's face. It looked like a real living nightmare. I could feel it looking at me, and for some reason, this just terrified me. All of a sudden, this thing began to make this groaning noise, like it was starting to move. Maybe it didn't realize that I was looking back at it, so I ducked inside my sleeping bag, completely petrified this thing was going to get me. I could barely breathe and had tears running down my face, while my friends in the distance, while scared, had no idea this was going on. I think they were still cracking jokes. I was trying not to make a sound because it felt like this thing was really there with me inside the tent. And after what seemed like an eternity, I could hear it walk away from my tent and off into the woods. I began yelling at everybody to get up, to pack their stuff. We needed to leave right now, regardless of whether they wanted to or not. Nobody budged, and they fought against it, considering a lot of them were still drunk, and we were all 13 and 14. None of us wanted that talking to from our parents. I didn't care, though. I sat alone in my tent, sobbing for about 15 minutes, before packing everything up myself and just walking back home through the trail that led out of the forest, even though it was roughly 1 in the morning. I didn't care. I have not gone camping there again since, after all those years. And that group of friends, well, we didn't really hang out much after this. I don't know why I haven't gone back there. It's just, I know this thing is out there, whatever it is. I can't seem to forget about what happened in those woods when I was younger, no matter how hard I try. Anyway, I doubt you're going to believe me, so I guess why am I bothering writing this? Thanks for letting me share my story, though. This is the first time I've ever really told anybody else, other than some family members and close friends. Oh, and one last thing. You might think I'm crazy for walking out there at night by myself, but you don't understand. I was so scared. I didn't care. I just was desperate to get away from whatever this large creature was. At the time, I just understood it to be a monster, or something I did not quite understand. I hunted with my uncle. He likes to call it hunting. To me, it's sitting and drinking beer until you get bored. We started at 8 a.m., drove 20 miles to the river without any luck. Afterwards, we sat in the truck for 4 hours with him, looking through binoculars while he had a few beers. He would look up every once in a while and scan back down towards his drink, or whatever bottle of poison he was hiding from his wife. Then, we heard something. I've never been one to believe in Bigfoot, but after hearing the strange sound, running into some very strange people, and finally seeing what I saw, let's just say I'm not so sure anymore what I believe. It was coming from behind the trees behind us. There was a large barbed wire fence. There were also no game trails down there. I looked over at my uncle, and he said, "Somebody must be hunting here." He gets out, walked back around his truck. Now remember, I'm a city boy for the most part. Born and raised, so this next part is very hard for me to admit, but I'll tell you what happened, and you can decide for yourself whether or not you believe me. We ran through the grass, climbing over the barbed wire fence and getting cut up pretty good, into the heavy brush on the other side, where we both heard the noise. Now, I should also say that as soon as we got out of the truck, we realized there was no person there, so my uncle thought it was a big buck, which is why we went chasing after it. But there was nothing there, and we did not hear the buck run off. There were no animal tracks, nothing. We looked around for about a few minutes, gave up, and started walking back to the truck. Still thinking about it, when my uncle and I both heard this ungodly scream, like nothing we'd ever heard before, and a loud crash, like something barreling through the woods close to us. My uncle dropped his binoculars, looking for the missing buck, and drew his tiny pistol. He left his rifle in the truck. We both ran as fast as we could, not slowing down. This thing sounded like a moose running through the trees wearing bowling balls on its feet and body. We sprinted toward the truck, and we see behind us this hair-covered man that's the size of a small giant, swinging wildly, crashing through the trees, screaming and moaning. Anyway, my uncle stops, takes a shot, and this thing stopped in its tracks and disappeared into the brush. Now, I didn't see his face, but from what I could see, this thing was awful. I'm pretty sure I saw a flat nose and deep sunken-in eyes. It was black all over its body, and kind of reminded me of a half-man, half-gorilla, in my opinion. But that's when my memory goes blank, and I remember waking up in the truck bed with my uncle shaking me. Now, what my uncle relayed to me was after he shot it, this thing disappeared, and then he grabbed me, which I apparently fainted from fear, and put me in the back of the truck. I'd only been unconscious for maybe 3 to 4 minutes, but at that point, he pulled out a silver flask and handed it to me, so that he'd seen what it did, and that if I wasn't sipping his magic potion, then no more of the story would be needing to come out for a while. He was pretty adamant about this, so don't ask me many questions about what happened after he shot at him. All I know is up until that point, none of it still really makes sense, but after I took a couple swigs of his magic flask, we got back in the truck and we drove out of there. My uncle, who passed away last year in 2020, refused to ever talk about it again. I think it deeply scared him, but he died of COVID pneumonia back at the end of March of 2020. I still really miss him. I thought my hunting trip with my friends was going to be like any other trip. We had our rifles and our backpacks ready. We were headed out into the wilderness of Michigan to get some practice in before our deer season started. Now, I know that what we were doing wasn't necessarily legal, but then again, many people do things that are not legal. We decided that the Grand River National Forest would be a great place to start. It held lots of different varieties of animals, bears, wolves, and the occasional mountain lion. Even a few other sightings have been reported. Being one of the most remote counties, Jackson County is where you want to take your troubles if you don't want anybody else around for miles on end. And I couldn't have chosen a better spot for this occasion. At least, that's what I thought. We had been hiking for hours, trying to find any trace of animals. And surprisingly, even though it was late summer, we weren't seeing much. Now, we were incredibly frustrated. We had been spending hours out here and we couldn't even find a darn rabbit. We had even been following a small game trail. And right there, as we came around a bend in the trail, everything around us, like the atmosphere, kind of shifted. Things got really quiet, and we could all feel that our hair had raised on our necks, feeling uncomfortable. A few of us mentioned a few words about it, but just continued onwards. Then, all of us at the same time stopped dead in our tracks and stared ahead, as this large shadow off the side of the path began moving. Then, we all saw 2 big brown eyes staring right back at us from underneath this large bush. We thought it might have belonged to a deer or elk. We knew that even though deer season wasn't yet open, it didn't necessarily mean that anything, because there would be more people out here illegally hunting. But this far out, it didn't make sense. This thing, which we realized was not a deer or elk, stood up. It was clearly crouched down. We were amazed by its height. We could see right there, this was some sort of large hairy man. Now you need to understand something. None of us ever entertained the idea of a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. As far as I can recollect, this was never on any of our minds. It seemed a little bit startled and began to move away from us as fast as it could, disappearing into the brush within seconds. We were all shocked, and we followed after it for a bit, trying to get a better look at what this was. As it turned around, it let out this scream because we knew it was in our pursuit. Right then and there, we all got this bloodlust and wanted to kill it, thinking if this really was a Bigfoot, we could kill it and have evidence. We never did catch up with him though, and what happened next makes me regret even looking for him and trying to run after him. We decided after a while to turn around and head back north to our last spawning site, hoping that we would find this thing again as we traveled. As we're walking along the path, hoping we would find this thing, my friend Greg spotted this big patch of dried red blood on the ground. Maybe I forgot to mention, but Greg also shot this thing as it was running away, which is why it screamed. So sorry if I forgot to include that. The gunshot was still ringing in our ears when the thought crossed our minds. We continued on our way north in search of this thing. We figured that this thing had been bleeding out from the gunshot wound. We would be easier to find now. He would have to travel slower. We were getting pretty excited at this point, thinking we were about to bag this first North American ape or something. But as we came around another curve in the path, we heard something move behind us. We all spun around quickly, and we were looking straight into this thing's eyes again. Bleeding. This thing looked angry. And this time, he wasn't running away from us. Instead, he ran directly toward us, and as he did, we could all have this sense, especially me, that we were going to die. This creature slammed into me, with nearly all of its force knocking me back before I had time to react. It threw me off the trail, 15 feet down into a small ditch, where a bunch of trees and bramble grew. It literally just picked me up off the ground and threw me like I was a rag doll. I was pretty badly injured. Then, he grabs my other friend, wraps his hand around him, and throws him really hard against a tree. He started charging towards Greg next, who fired his gun up at his chest multiple times. Greg began yelling in agony too when he got slammed against the tree, snapping it right down to its base at about 8 feet tall, and standing right beside where the creature had smacked him with force. This thing, for some reason, was just toying with us, because it barely smacked us and we all went flying. For some reason, it seemed like it was restraining its killing power, which I'm not sure if that was intentional or not. I believe this creature was in fact moving in for the kill, when a couple of similar screams peered off in the distance. I assume now that it was another one of these creatures calling to it. The way this thing responded with a loud scream that hurt our ears, and then taking off in that direction. We were all pretty badly injured, bleeding, several broken bones. I'm surprised that none of us died. We somehow managed to pull our way out of the ditch that we landed in, and made it back to the truck, which took hours since we were so severely injured. I was convinced that this creature was going to hunt us down and kill us. This thing had broken several of my bones, shattered a rib, and it threw me 15 feet into the tree. We all had to be admitted to the hospital for days with severe cuts, internal bruising, and broken bones. Luckily, we all recovered. I'm barely scratching the surface of the severity of what happened, but I don't got time to go into all the details. Long story short, this thing messed me and my friends up, and had it not been for its buddy calling it, we would have been murdered by this creature. It was a colder night in October. I remember it, and the leaves were beginning to turn, and the air that had crisp, musty smell of autumn. I was sitting at my kitchen table with nothing but a cup of coffee for company when I heard it. This low roar or growl coming from somewhere in the woods behind my house. It sounded like an animal, maybe a large canine, but something about it did not sound right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I shivered as goosebumps broke out all over my skin, despite the warmth of my room. Suddenly, I heard another roar in conjunction with this one, louder and closer. So I jumped up from my chair, ran outside into our backyard to see what this was. I couldn't see anything, just trees. You might think I'm crazy for running out to see what this was, but in that moment, I was more curious than afraid. The noise again grew louder, sounding just beyond the fencing. Then, I heard something crushing through the brush. At first, maybe it could have been a bear. I did not want it to go after our chickens. I grabbed a flashlight from the patio table, ran to the chicken coop to check on them, only to discover that they were all locked away, safely, in their little den. Next, I went into the garage, grabbing my husband's shotgun. It sounded like whatever it was really close, and I'm not going to let it get my chickens. It wasn't long before I noticed another movement in the trees, and was able to see something black and hairy. It appeared at first to be a bear, but as I shined my flashlight directly onto it, it walked away. After taking aim, I fired a shot in the direction, hoping maybe the noise would scare it off, but nothing. Then came another roar, louder than before, straight from right behind me. Before I could even register what had happened, this other thing lunged out of the darkness at me with open jaws, only to land an attack mere inches away from me when it ran into the end of my shotgun barrel, which pointed straight back at him. As soon as we made eye contact, I fired. This thing went screaming, running off into the woods. I watched it run out of sight, severely injured and bleeding badly. I had shot a Bigfoot. Then another thought flashed through my mind. There's more of them. Should I go into the woods to look for him and hunt him down and kill him, or wait until morning? After agonizing over it for what seemed like forever, I decided to go back inside and get my husband. Together, we could finish the job. Before going back outside, though, I called the police to report that I had just shot an animal, a bear in our backyard, only to have them say, "What?" Apparently, they don't receive too many reports of people shooting bears so late at night. They acted very skeptical and could tell that I was actually meaning something else, but they agreed to send somebody. I got back inside, and everything was quiet outside. Somebody had arrived on the scene and were shining their flashlights around to see if they could find anything. They called me over to where they were standing. They had found something. Blood. I explained that a large bear, very aggressive in nature, had tried to get into the property and break into the chicken coop. The officer just kind of looked at me, blankly, and right then, we all three, my husband, the officer, and I, heard this loud scream from back behind the woods, maybe 100 yards back from where the second creature that I shot with the shotgun ran off to. The color from the officer's face drained so quickly, and said, "Ma'am, give me a moment," and he walked off and started radioing something. I couldn't hear, but his expression was panicked and nervous. He walked back over to me and said, "Ma'am, I'm going to have my supervisor come here and take over for me. Good luck." And just like that, got in his patrol car and left. And my husband and I weren't really sure what to do, since the only way we can even deal with this with an officer was now shot down. After he left, we went back inside the house, keeping the shotgun ready. The night was full of screams and yells, and our house was pounded on. We didn't feel it was safe to go outside and try and shoot at these things anymore. But in the morning, we woke up to all of our chickens dead. All 18 of them, ripped to pieces. Not shredded, but it looked like somebody had grabbed them, ripped all the heads and just ripped them apart, in pieces. It was a bloody mess. And part of their cage, or their chicken coop, was just ripped open, like something large had come through and just tore it. We never paid attention to the whole Bigfoot idea, but we actually moved shortly after that. Easily one of the most terrifying things that I've ever gone through. Luckily, my husband and I now don't deal with anything like this ever again. But do you think this could have been a Sasquatch